When I was in college, I had a buddy whose father owned about 800 acres of land out in eastern Oklahoma. In the past, he'd leased it out to hunters and logging companies, but he'd stopped doing that a while back. He had a cabin on the property that he'd built years earlier, and he'd let us head out there once in a while to hang out. It was a perfect spot for unwinding from college stress and spending some time in nature. During spring break of 1995, we loaded up our trucks and set off for the cabin, planning to shoot guns, drink a few beers, and enjoy all the typical things country folks like us did in the woods. That first morning was busy as we settled in, tidying up the cabin and unloading our gear. By dinner time, we had a big fire going outside and cooked up a hearty meal of steaks and fried potatoes. Skipping dessert, we cracked open a few beers. The sun set not long after, and we spent the rest of the evening drinking and passing around a joint or two. Sometime later in the night, I heard something shuffling outside, so I went to investigate. The fire had burned down low by then, and just beyond the light's reach, I could make out a figure. A person, maybe, standing still. It looked like he was facing me, watching and waiting to see what I'd do. I tried to focus, squinting hard to make out more, but the angle and dim light made it difficult. Even so, the shape didn't move, so I figured I'd take a few steps closer to get a better look. Though I was nervous, I felt strangely drawn to it, or maybe I was too buzzed to make a better choice. As I took a couple of steps forward, a voice behind me broke my concentration. My friend had woken up, seen the open door, and came outside, catching me walking around the fire. His voice startled me, but I quickly recognized it. I asked him if he could see the figure on the far side of the fire. He just laughed, saying I was probably so stoned I was imagining things. We laughed it off and I headed back inside. On my way in, I glanced back one last time, but the figure was gone. I shrugged it off and went to bed. The next morning, I brushed the experience aside, figuring it was just my imagination, and went about the day. We spent the first half fishing at the big pond and later shotguns and tested out a compound bow one of the guys had just bought. After dinner, we got into some beers and lit a joint, trying a game of poker before abandoning it in favor of telling tall tales around the fire. That night, when I went off to relieve myself, I got spooked by a stick cracking nearby, so I quickly returned to the fire. The others laughed at my startled expression. I explained, but they reminded me that animals lived in the woods too, so I shrugged it off. Not long after, we were gathered around the fire, deep in conversation. I turned to talk to the guy on my left, and what I saw made me freeze. Just a few steps behind my friend stood a man I didn't recognize, staring directly at him with intense focus, as if trying to bore a hole through his head. As I continued looking, I realized it was the same figure I'd seen outside the fire's light the previous night, about average height, with a long, wild beard. My friend kept talking, unaware of the stranger's gaze. After a long moment, the stranger shifted his gaze to me, gave a blank look, then turned and walked off. My friend finally noticed my expression and snapped me out of my daze. I started describing what I'd just seen, but my friends laughed, saying I was still seeing things. One of them joked it might be Bigfoot, but despite my insistence, they didn't believe me. The next couple of days were quiet, no sign of the stranger. I kept my eyes peeled, though half expecting him to appear again. By the fifth morning, I began doubting myself. I'd seen this eerie figure twice, yet now he seemed to have vanished. Eventually, I decided to let it go, at least until more proof came along. One day, my friend's dad mentioned that a nearby property owner had spotted some wild hogs on his land. So we took our rifles and set out to find them. After following some trails, we found fresh signs and tracked them on foot. A mile or so in, we came across 3 large hogs rooting around, ready for the hunt. 2 of us raised our rifles, but just as we were about to shoot, a loud crack rang out, and a bullet hit the wood above my friend's head. We barely had time to realize we were being shot at before another shot landed even closer. Not waiting for a third, We ducked onto a side trail that led back to the cabin. As we neared it, the shooting resumed. With no other choice, we jumped into my truck and sped away. Cell phones weren't common back then, so we had to drive nearly 20 miles to town to get help. After explaining the situation, we returned with deputies. We approached cautiously, and once parked, waited to see if any shots would follow, but nothing happened. Looking around, we found bullet holes in the cabin and my buddy's truck windshield. Our camping gear, luckily, wasn't taken, though some items, including a box of ammo and my sleeping bag, were missing. The officers suspected a squatter or poacher might have been hiding out there, and my friend's dad urged them to investigate further. I told them about seeing a stranger around the cabin, and finally, they took me seriously. They searched the property for a week, finding only a few abandoned campsites. It seemed the stranger had moved on, aware that we were now on high alert. After that, we stopped visiting the property. Our nature trips dwindled, and by the time my friend's dad passed away, he had renewed the logging lease, turning the land over to timber production. When I jot down memories from those days, I remember those awesome trips, but especially that strange and chilling week that brought them to an end. Occasionally, I still talk to my old college buddy on the phone. As far as he knows, that mysterious stranger was never caught. We still speculate about who he might have been and where he ended up. But when I'm alone, I often wonder why he seems so fixated on my friend, and if he's still out there, waiting for another chance to finish what he started so many years ago. In the early 2000s, while I was studying law, I worked late shifts delivering pizza for a big-name chain. I had done similar work in my younger years while at the local community college whenever I needed some quick money. Despite all the stories warning about the job's dangers, I never once faced a thief. I'm sure it was riskier back in the day, but by the time I got into it, companies had already learned to reduce the risks by making rules, like only allowing drivers to carry $20, which helped cut down the chances of being held up. Although I was lucky enough not to experience a robbery, I did go through one or two frightening moments worth mentioning. The scariest of these happened back in the early 2000s. At that point, I knew the city like the back of my hand, having moved there after junior college and delivered for different places over 5 years. I was familiar with almost every corner of the place. However, one night, I was sent to an address that neither I nor any other driver had ever heard of. When the order came in, I went straight to the map to check the address, but it wasn't listed. Even my phone's GPS didn't recognize it. We didn't have restricted delivery areas at the time, so I had no choice but to go. Theoretically, the location would have existed if the street extended about 10 blocks further. So, I turned onto the road about a block before it ended and headed south. Sure enough, a new stretch of pavement began where the old road left off. I kept driving along this new road for what felt like miles, with nothing on either side and not a single car in sight. I couldn't believe the state managed to build this without any mention of it in the news. After 5 years of driving all over the city, I never knew this area existed. Part of me was excited to see it, like an explorer tracing a hidden trail, but another part of me felt a chill. This empty road appearing out of nowhere was unsettling. It was probably 10 minutes before I saw the house I was looking for in the distance. I couldn't understand why anyone would put a house all the way out here, with no easy way to reach it. As I got closer, I saw that the house looked old, probably 50 years or more, and likely hadn't been maintained in decades. There weren't any cars around, and for a moment, I thought the place was abandoned, but I noticed the front door was open behind a creaky screen door. Everything looked fine, so I took the pizza and walked to the door. I knocked, but no one answered. I could see what looked like a young woman moving around in the kitchen. I knocked again, and this time I heard a woman's voice telling me to come in. Although I was hesitant, I stepped just inside and waited in the small entryway. I'd learned from other drivers never to go fully into an unfamiliar house, but I hadn't seen anything alarming yet. I assumed she'd be out to pay me shortly. Instead, I heard a man's voice, barely a whisper, saying, "Call him into the kitchen." The moment I heard that, I bolted out of there as fast as I could. I was so shaken, I made it back to the restaurant in half the time it took me to get there. I told my manager everything, and he immediately called the police. The whole ordeal left me rattled, so my manager sent me home early. A few hours later, the police called me back. They said that by the time they got there, whoever had been in the house was long gone. While the place looked mostly abandoned, they did find signs that people had been inside recently, which confirmed what I had told them. They also explained why the road and house were there in the first place. The state had been trying to buy the land where the new road and house were for 2 decades, but the owner wouldn't sell. Even after trying to take it by eminent domain, a judge blocked it. The owner passed away 2 years ago, and his children finally sold it to the state, which quickly began road construction. Although the road wasn't technically open yet, locals had already started using it. This cleared up some questions, but I still wondered how those people knew about the empty house in the middle of nowhere. The officer didn't have an answer for that. He could only guess that they stumbled upon it and saw it as a good spot to target a delivery driver. He pointed out that, in desperate situations, even $20 might seem worth the risk. "People have done worse for less," he said. The officer did share one bit of good news. The county was set to tear down the old house in the coming week, so no other delivery driver would end up there in a bad situation. 2 days later, as I drove down the newly paved road, now my shortcut across town, I saw the house being demolished. It was a relief to see it go, and I vowed never to enter a customer's house or make a delivery somewhere unfamiliar again. Maybe one day, I'll tell my other story. It wasn't as intense, but it still left me with some lingering fear. Since my parents split up before I was born, I grew up dividing my time between their homes. Every summer, until I turned 19, I'd spend those warm months with my dad in the quiet countryside of Missouri. Dad had lived there all his life, and much of his family was still around. With little to do, like going to the movies, I'd pass the time hanging out with my older cousin, getting into whatever trouble we could find. Many of those long summer days were spent exploring the woods around us. One day, during one of our wanderings, we stumbled across a big lake, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The water was incredibly clear, and the lake was full of huge fish. We asked the adults if they knew about it, but no one had ever heard of it. That was probably why there were so many big fish. No one around seemed to fish there, and any who might have before must have forgotten where it was. We went back to fish 3 or 4 times, each time coming home with a good catch. On our 5th trip, we hoped to gather enough for a big fish fry with the family, a way to close out the summer as it was winding down. It was a warm Saturday morning when we set out, starting before dawn because the walk took over an hour. Besides, the fish would stop biting once the sun was high, and we wanted to be back by early afternoon. As we approached the lake around sunrise, we were eager to get started. Soon enough, we got our first bites, and the fish kept coming for the next few hours. By 10:45, we'd hit our limit, and I was ready to head home. The return walk would take around 90 minutes, especially with 2 5-gallon buckets filled to the top with fish. But to my frustration, my cousin thought it would be fun to swim in the lake before we left. He tried to get me to join him, but since I didn't know how to swim, I just wanted to get back. Still, being older, he had the final say. I sat on a rock, waiting for him. There was an old rope tied to a tree. Looked like it had been there forever, and he wanted to swing from it. It seemed risky to me, but he just laughed off my worries, stripped down to his boxers, and set his clothes beside me. He climbed the tree a bit, grabbed the rope, and swung out. But just a few feet out, the rope snapped. He fell into the deep water, though maybe not as far as he intended. When he hit the surface, there was a strange, dull sound. I'd planned on laughing and saying, "Told you so." But as the seconds ticked by, he didn't come back up. I started to get nervous, looking around to see if he'd resurfaced somewhere further out, maybe knocked out from the hard hit. But there was nothing. Panic set in, and I waded out as far as I dared, straining to see him below. But with each step, the water grew murkier, making it impossible to spot him. Soon I realized he'd drowned. How exactly, I couldn't understand. Maybe if I'd known how to swim, I could have helped, but it was too late. All I could do was gather our things and make the walk back home. The entire way, I clung to a tiny hope that he'd just been pranking me and would appear at any moment. But that didn't happen, and the dread of telling my family grew heavier with each step. I tried several times to form the words, but each attempt left me choked up, tears welling up. All I could finally get out was, "Mark drowned." They understood after that, and when I managed to pull myself together, I took my dad and uncle back to the lake. Mark's body was nowhere to be found. With no other option, we went to the sheriff's office to report the drowning. I started to freak out, terrified that I'd be blamed for his death. After a while, they convinced me I wasn't in trouble, though I couldn't shake the guilt each time I looked at my uncle. I explained to the sheriff what had happened, and the search began the next morning. By coincidence, that was the day I was heading back to my mom's place. That Monday night, she sat me down to tell me that divers had found Mark's body earlier that day. His foot had gotten tangled on a sunken log, which they guessed was the reason he hadn't resurfaced. I wish I could say this brought me some relief, but it didn't. It did, however, push me to learn how to swim. The regret of not being able to help my cousin stayed with me for years, and I vowed never to be in that helpless position again. In a strange way, his death made a positive impact on my life. But if I had the choice, I'd still much rather have him here. Even though this might sound like something out of a typical horror flick, I promise it's real. It all started on a scorching day last July. My car, almost 2 decades old, has a habit of overheating on days like this. But until I find a better paying job, I'm stuck with it. On that day, I was driving along rural backroads, looking for a dog breeder a friend had recommended. After hours of searching, it was the hottest part of the day, and my car started to overheat, forcing me to pull over. I grabbed my phone to call my girlfriend, only to see the battery had died. After a few minutes of cursing my luck, I accepted that I'd need to find someone with a working phone, and I wouldn't get that unless I started walking soon. I noticed an old farmhouse off in the distance and began heading toward it. What should have taken half an hour took nearly an hour due to the intense heat, and I had to stop multiple times along the way. Finally, I reached the house. The area around it looked more like a scrapyard, with old car parts scattered everywhere. I had to weave my way through them to get to the front door. I knocked for several minutes but got no response. Thinking the owner might be hard of hearing, I walked around and peered into the windows, hoping to spot someone inside. On one side of the house, I saw a phone hanging on the wall in the kitchen. Excited, I started calling out for someone, but even after walking all the way around the house, no one responded. I was about to give up when I noticed a woman lying on a bed. I almost banged on the window to get her attention, but I thought it might startle her. Instead, I went back to the front door and let myself in. Thinking back, that was just as unnerving. Before entering, I tore a piece of paper from a small notebook I carry and left a note explaining why I was there. I called out as I approached the bedroom, but still, there was no response. The closer I got to the woman, the more unsettled I felt. She was lying flat on her back, staring blankly at the ceiling. At first, I thought she was watching a TV that was on in the room, but her eyes were fixed and didn't move. I approached, and when I was close enough, I extended the note to her. When the paper touched her hand, she didn't react. This made me move closer, and that's when I realized something was terribly wrong. Her face was dry, almost like it had been preserved. Her hair was jet black, a shade you rarely see on older women. By this point, she had to have known I was there, but her eyes remained fixed. That's what made me lean in even more, to look directly at her eyes. Rather than the slight redness you'd see in most people's eyes, hers looked glossy, as if they were artificial. Even then, I wasn't certain she was dead until I touched her. I thought she might be a mannequin, so I reached out to touch her hand. Her skin felt dry and stone cold. Just as the shock of this was starting to sink in, I heard a loud creak behind me. Without a second thought, I sprinted out of there and ran back down the road toward my car. Half a mile later, I ran into an older man in a truck. Thankfully, he offered me a ride back into town. I kept quiet about my experience, and anytime he tried to make small talk, I kept my responses short, on the off chance he knew something about what I'd seen. He let me borrow his phone to call my girlfriend, who agreed to meet us at a gas station on the edge of town. When he dropped me off there, I thanked him and he drove away. Once I was safe in my girlfriend's car, I used her phone to call the police. I hadn't even told her yet, so her shocked expression as I described what I saw reminded me of my own reaction. The police assured me they'd send someone to check it out. I then called a tow truck to pick up my car. The police never followed up, so after 3 days, I called them to ask what they found. After a few minutes, I finally got someone who was aware of my call. The officer explained that he and his partner had searched the property but found nothing unusual, especially not a preserved-looking woman. I thanked him and hung up. What happened after I left the house is anyone's guess. The noise I heard behind me might have been the homeowner hiding her body, knowing I'd call the authorities. To be honest, I'm not certain what I saw on that bed. I'm sure it was a person, but that's about it. More than once, I've thought of going back with a camera to prove what I saw, but fear of what else might be there has held me back. Still, if the nightmares of her empty stare persist, I may not have a choice. Ms. Otto might have taken place in the early 2000s. My husband was still spending most of his time on the road, working for one of the larger insurance companies. Because of this, my young daughters and I spent most of our days alone. A few years earlier, we had purchased a new home on a somewhat secluded piece of land, and the drive between town and home could be nerve-wracking, especially in heavy rain. Most of the last 5 miles of the road leading to the house was nothing more than loose gravel and wasn't very wide, either. My daughter and I found ourselves stuck on this stretch of road one particularly rough night. I did everything I could to keep our old Subaru on the road, but the rain made it nearly impossible to see. It wasn't long before I misjudged a curve and landed in the ditch. Thankfully, my husband had thought ahead and signed us up for one of those roadside assistance plans. I called them, and they told me the weather was keeping them busy, but they'd get to us as soon as they could. Not knowing how long we'd be stranded, I made my daughter as comfortable as possible and waited. The rain let up not long after, and I was finally able to see how far we were from home. I guessed it was around 2.5 miles, and I thought about walking until I remembered no one would be home to retrieve the car later. Help was on the way, so I decided to wait. Within about 10 minutes of the accident, I saw the headlights of a truck coming toward us, and I felt a wave of relief. However, it wasn't a tow truck. It was an older man in a rusty pickup. When he spotted our car, he slowed down and looked in as he passed. I thought he might offer to pull us out, but he kept driving. I didn't think much of it at first, but about 5 minutes later, that same rusty truck came toward us again, this time from the other direction, moving very slowly. He looked at me as he passed again, even making eye contact briefly, but still didn't stop. Things started feeling odd. but I thought maybe he was lost and just trying to turn around to get back to the main road. He wasn't obligated to help, after all, and maybe he assumed I was parked rather than stuck. It wasn't until I noticed the same truck approaching a third time that things began to feel truly alarming. By then, it was completely dark outside, and as a woman alone with my daughter, I felt much less safe once night had fallen. The situation felt more unsettling now. He did his usual slow pass by, but this time he stopped the truck after he passed us, did a quick three-point turn, and now was facing us again about 10 yards away. Instead of coming over to offer assistance, he just sat in his truck, watching us. After a few minutes, he finally opened his door and began to get out. Almost immediately, another set of headlights appeared from the other direction. The man waited where he was, watching for a moment, until he could see it was a tow truck. As soon as he realized this, he jumped back into his cab, did a fast U-turn, and sped away from us. My heart was pounding as I watched this unfold, but I finally felt relief when I could see the name of the tow company on the side of the truck. The tow driver wasted no time hooking up to my car, and I finally felt confident he was genuinely there to help. I got out to thank him, and within minutes, he had us out of the ditch and on our way. For the rest of the drive, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that rusty truck. Even as I pulled into our driveway, I worried I'd spot it lurking somewhere, waiting for us. But thankfully, it was nowhere in sight, and I got my daughter safely inside for the night. When my husband got back from his latest work trip, I told him what had happened during the storm, though I left out the part with the odd truck, knowing it would only worry him more when he was away. He didn't have much choice but to continue his travels for work. Due to this last scare, though, he went out and bought me a nearly new Jeep with four-wheel drive. I was thrilled to have it, and I never got stuck again, even on the muddiest parts of our property. That stranger in the rusty truck faded from my mind fairly quickly, though for a couple of weeks, I found myself keeping an eye out for it whenever I was on that road. I'd nearly forgotten about the whole incident until recently, when I saw a similar truck at the store. It wasn't the same one, of course, but seeing it brought everything rushing back and inspired me to write this. Fortunately, since then, the county has paved and widened the road, and now my wonderful husband comes home to us every night. About 5 years ago, when I was 16, I was living in a rural area in northern West Virginia, where the forest stretched endlessly. That night, I was home alone with my little brother because our mom was away at a baby shower. I was making dinner in the kitchen when I suddenly heard a loud knocking coming from the front porch. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect from someone waiting to be let in, more like a few loud taps close to one of the front windows. I paused and looked around. From the kitchen, I could see the front door and one of the front windows. All the lights on the main floor were on, so the dark outside only reflected my own living room back at me. After waiting for a few moments and hearing nothing more, I shrugged it off and turned my focus back to the stove. 5 minutes later, just as I'd stopped thinking about it, the noise happened again, this time from a different front window further down the house. "Mark," I called out, thinking maybe it was my brother. There was no response. I went to the front of the house and pressed my hands to the glass, trying to see outside, but I saw nothing. Just then, my brother came down the stairs. "Did you just hear something out back?" he asked. I gestured for him to be quiet, and right on cue, we heard footsteps slowly crossing the wooden floor of our wraparound porch near the dining room wall. "There's someone out there?" I whispered, feeling more anger than fear. We should have just locked the doors and yelled that we were calling the police, but I was young, stubborn, and furious that someone was daring to mess with us. I remember my brother asking if the person was trying to distract us, but by then, I was already opening the gun cabinet. I should mention that I was taught to handle firearms responsibly, so I took out a 9mm from the drawer and loaded it. "I'm going to scare him off," I told my brother. "Lock the front door behind me." Before he could argue, I headed to the door with the gun in hand. I swung the door open and stepped onto the porch, just as my brother turned on the outdoor lights. Right there, about 8 feet away, was a thin, sickly-looking guy in a hoodie, with pale blue eyes and a scruffy patch of hair on his chin. He'd been stepping toward the porch, but as soon as he saw me, he spun around and bolted as fast as he could. I took a few steps forward, then aimed the gun into the air and fired a shot. "That's right, get lost," I yelled after him, waiting until he vanished into the trees before I turned back toward the house. But then I froze. For a moment, my heart seemed to stop. I felt an icy chill run through me, and my heartbeat pounded so hard I could feel it. There were at least 8 more people standing quietly on the edge of our porch and more scattered across the yard. Most of them were men, but I spotted at least 2 women, all wearing dark jackets and hoodies and looking to be in their early 20s. No one said a word. They just stood there, hands in their pockets, staring at me. I couldn't tell if any of them were armed, but after a few seconds, they all turned and started to leave. Some jogged, while others simply walked back into the woods in different directions. For a second, I'd forgotten I was even holding a gun until I raised my hands and felt its weight. I rushed back to the front door and banged on it until my brother let me in. I had no idea what to tell him. I had just fired a gun into the air, but none of them had reacted or called out. If they were just drunk kids pulling a prank, they would have said something like, "Sorry, wrong house," and left. Instead, they looked at me almost like I'd spoiled their plans, and then just walked off, as if they were more disappointed than scared. My brother quickly turned on every light in the house and called the police. They showed up within about 10 minutes and inspected the area. They found footprints everywhere and asked us several times if we just had a party. I kept insisting that a dozen or more people had been hanging around our house in the dark, but they didn't seem too alarmed. They asked if the strangers had actually threatened us, and I had to admit that, technically, they hadn't. After telling them about the shot I'd fired, they took the gun but returned it later on. To this day, I still don't know what those people were doing outside our home that night. My brother thinks they were part of some cult or planning some strange ritual, maybe even targeting us for something sinister. I, on the other hand, thought it was more likely they wanted to break in and rob us but saw the gun and thought better of it. Still, it didn't explain the silence. Not one of them made a sound while looking at me, and then all at once they just scattered. I've read accounts of UFO sightings where people claim to have been entranced by lights and later find themselves somewhere unfamiliar, with no memory of how they got there. I can't ignore the possibility that something strange was at work. That group has never come back, and I haven't seen anyone from that night around town. Not long afterward, we got a dog. Years back, when I was still in high school, my brother and 2 cousins set out on a lengthy hike, venturing deep into the isolated forest behind our home. We'd roamed these woods countless times as kids, but this time we aimed to push farther than ever before. We packed enough food, flashlights, and supplies, fully aware that we might be gone for several hours, or even end up needing to camp overnight. I did my best to map out our route with a compass and an old map. It was reckless. 4 teens, all under 17, thinking we could handle such a deep journey into the wilderness. But we were young and confident, and our parents didn't try to stop us. I was the oldest and the biggest, so I carried most of our supplies, including tents and water, while my brother Joe carried the first aid kit and flashlights. My cousins Lily and Tom split the food, and Lily had a flare gun with a single shot, which we figured would be enough. We walked for most of the day without any issues. After a few hours, we spotted a wooden structure rising above the treetops. Not sure what it was, we decided to head toward it and make that our campsite. By the time we reached it, the sun was beginning to set, and it turned out to be an old, forgotten watchtower. likely once used to spot forest fires. We guessed it stood around 60 to 70 feet tall, but it looked risky to climb. The stairway spiraled around the outside, with no supporting beams to stabilize it. We dropped our bags at the base and debated how high we should go. Lily and I wanted to reach the top, but Joe and Tom were worried the stairs might collapse beneath us. Still, Lily and I started climbing slowly, placing one cautious foot in front of the other. About halfway up, a rotting plank broke under me, and my leg went straight through the damp wood, twisting my right leg awkwardly. I yelped, pulled my leg free, and carefully sat on the stairs. Hearing my cry, Joe and Tom began rushing up, while Lily started back down. Probably not the best decision, but we were panicked. When the others reached me, I insisted I was okay, saying we couldn't all stay up here on such shaky stairs and should start heading down. Joe was the first to get to the bottom, and as he turned, he pointed to a nearby tree and shouted, "Hey, you!" We all looked and saw someone standing by a tree, just watching us. We couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but the figure was very thin, with a wild mane of gray hair, wearing an old, filthy jacket and jumpsuit, as if pulled from a dumpster. The four of us froze, staring silently as the figure stared back. Suddenly, the stranger began moving toward the stairs. We panicked, scrambling up as fast as we could to the platform. I stopped about 2/3 of the way up and looked down. The person was rifling through our bags at the base. I shouted, "Get the heck out of there!" While the others worked on opening the trapdoor at the top, the stranger looked up and said something I couldn't understand. Maybe because of all the noise from the others above me, or maybe because they weren't speaking English. The voice was high-pitched, so I assumed it was a woman. I pulled out a small pocket knife, waiting nervously in case she tried to follow us up. But she didn't. Instead, she sat at the base, eating our food and taking most of our stuff. By the time night fell, she was still down there, and we didn't know what to do. We couldn't get the trapdoor open, and it was too dark to safely climb down. I know you might think, why didn't you just go down and confront her? That thought crossed my mind many times, but without flashlights and with my injury, it seemed too risky. She could have had a weapon, and we knew she had the flare gun. Even if we'd had it, we couldn't use it effectively under the platform. By dawn, I was sore, starving, and stiff. Joe, Tom, and Lily had stayed awake, barely shifting to avoid making noise. The woman was gone. We made our way to the bottom, grabbed what little was left of our gear, and Joe and Tom helped me hobble back home. It took us 14 grueling hours from the time I hurt my leg to when I finally collapsed on the couch at home. To this day, I don't know who that woman was. Maybe just a homeless drifter who had found a hidden spot in the woods. We also never figured out why the trapdoor wouldn't budge. Tom suggested that someone might have locked it from above, though we don't know how. As terrible as that experience was, we all made it back, shaken but unharmed, aside from my busted ankle. Looking back, I sometimes think my injury might have saved us. If we'd camped on the ground that night, who knows what might have happened if that strange woman had crept into our camp while we slept. Could have ended very differently. I was hired for a catalog shoot for a big-name company. The shoot was set for August 2015 in the remote parts of Wyoming. When the day arrived, I flew in and was driven to a cozy lodge in the mountains, which served as our base. I met the woman running the shoot for the company. We had collaborated once or twice before, and I was glad to be working with her again. Soon, her assistant joined us, and the three of us chatted for a bit before I was shown to my room. I had arrived late, so after a light dinner, I headed to bed. The next morning, everyone involved in the shoot, maybe around a dozen people, gathered in a big hall for breakfast. Once we finished eating, the woman in charge, her assistant, and I climbed into a jeep to scout out shooting spots. The models and a few others followed in another vehicle. After about an hour of driving, I spotted a stunning rocky outcrop where we set up. The lighting was perfect that day, so we needed minimal extra work to get the shots I wanted. A few hours later, we wrapped up at that spot, just in time for lunch. The other vehicle with the models headed back to the lodge, but my colleague convinced me to check out a beautiful spot she'd found on a walk the day before. She said she'd arrived early and had taken a walk before my plane landed. She promised it was close by, and we'd be back for lunch soon after the others. After a short 5-minute drive, we reached the location. She led us about 100 yards down a trail that stopped at a steep ledge. It was indeed a stunning place, but I could tell that without the right light, photos wouldn't do it justice. I mentioned this, and she walked closer to the edge to get a better view. She went out farther than I would have advised, clearly more focused on her work than on her safety. After one step too many, the loose rock gave way, causing her to fall down the cliffside. Her assistant, a sweet and petite young woman, rushed forward, and I had to hold her back to stop her from following her boss down the cliff. I told her to hold on to me firmly as I inched toward the ledge. Taking a deep breath, I leaned over and spotted the woman lying curled up around 70 feet below. She didn't move at first, and I feared the worst. But after watching a bit longer, I saw tiny, almost imperceptible movements. I let her assistant know and asked if she could drive. She said she could, so I told her to run back to the Jeep for help. She dashed down the trail, and soon, I could see the Jeep speeding toward the lodge. Though she might not have been able to respond, I wanted her to know that help was on the way, so I shouted down to her, hoping she could hear me. The minutes felt endless, but within half an hour, a rescue team arrived. 2 men were lowered down with a special stretcher, securing her onto it. When they brought her back up, it was obvious she was seriously hurt, though alive. An ambulance took her away, and all that was left for us was to wait. The shoot was put on hold until they decided how to move forward, and ultimately it was canceled indefinitely. That was the end of my involvement in the incident. I heard nothing for months until I got a call from her. The past 9 weeks had been almost like a nightmare for her and her family. The initial swelling in her brain was so severe she had to be placed in a coma. It eventually subsided, but the long hours of being bedridden nearly drove her mad. She had a long list of broken bones, well into the double digits, and even during our call, she was still using crutches. Since the accident, we've kept in touch. As of this writing, she has undergone 5 surgeries on different bones and areas of her body, with several more likely in her future. Despite the brutal impact of the fall and the grueling recovery that followed, she hasn't lost her sense of humor. On our last call just last week, she joked that if she had to do it all over again, she'd pick a shorter distance to fall from. A real fighter if I've ever known one. This is a true account of a frightening experience that 3 friends of mine went through the summer after one of them finished her junior year of high school. I almost ended up being part of the story myself, but a scheduled shift at the movie theater kept me from joining them. Earlier that day, they had stopped by my house, inviting me to go with them into the woods to explore an area we hadn't yet checked out. But since I had to work that evening, I had to say no. It's been over 25 years since this happened, so not every detail remains clear, but I'll try to recall as much as possible. Looking back now, life was so different for kids back then. Our neighborhood was like its own little town, set right on the outskirts of the city. Around the end of the 60s, a hopeful developer had the bold idea to buy up large sections of prairie and forest out in a remote area. He set up a small suburban area in anticipation of the manufacturing boom and the workers who'd fill those jobs. The factories came, companies like Johnson & Johnson and Folgers Coffee, but in just a few decades, many of them started to shut down or leave. The children of the factory workers grew up somewhat isolated from their peers in the city and often wandered the surrounding woods for adventure, much like the early settlers who explored these lands generations before. I was one of those kids, as were my 3 friends who would later make the discovery that I narrowly missed by not tagging along. They headed out to the fields beyond the new highway, which at that time stretched for miles. This summer, those fields lay fallow. In this part of Texas, the landscape shifts from open prairie to forested areas, so you can walk across miles of open land only to find yourself in dense woods. After walking across the empty fields for what felt like forever, they reached a section of forest we hadn't explored before. There, they found a path that led to an old barn. When they rounded the corner to peek inside, they were confronted with the body of a man who had hanged himself. At first, none of them thought it was real, but as they approached, they could tell it was indeed a corpse. It turned out to be a truck driver who had parked his big rig at a nearby truck stop around Christmas. He had walked the 3 miles into the woods to end his life. No one knows if he knew that barn was there or if he stumbled upon it by chance. But on that hot, humid summer day, his decayed body was a gruesome sight. Realizing someone might be missing him, my friends returned to the same truck stop he'd walked away from months earlier and called the police. I didn't hear about it until the next day, and while it sounded like an intense experience, I was grateful I hadn't been part of it. Over the years, each of them went on to deal with various legal and emotional challenges, including struggles with addiction. Of the 3, only Stephen is still alive, though he has spent time in and out of institutions, and when we last spoke, he was hardly the same friend from my childhood. I can't say that discovering the trucker's body was the only reason for their struggles, but it undoubtedly played a part in what followed.